The men who buried him never found the foundation. They saw the shack, they saw the man, they saw what he'd done with stone and sweat, but they never guessed what lay beneath. They marked the grave with a wooden cross. 2 winters later, the wood was gone, and so was the grave. But not the foundation, not the part he built for his boy. They say when the wind howls through the ravine where that cabin once stood, you can still hear the father's voice echoing against the stone, though there's no one left who knows his name. No one except a few old survey maps, maybe. And the stories passed around fire pits by men too proud to admit they once laughed at him. Because they had laughed. They laughed hard when they first saw what he was doing, stacking stone in the dirt like a Roman mason, laying trench work around it, digging deeper than any man ever had for a simple settler's cabin. One of them, Elias Trow, spat his chew in the dirt and said it was the dumbest thing he'd seen all winter. Another said he must have been drunk or touched in the head. No man needed a foundation like that, but he wasn't building it for any man. He was building it for a boy, and the boy had stopped walking that spring. No one knew what had happened exactly. Some said it was the pox. Others swore it was something worse, a fever that hit in the night and left the child speechless by morning. His name was Nathaniel, 8 years old. The father's name was Cal. They'd arrived late the year before, just before the snows, with nothing but a cart, 2 half-broke horses, and a bucket of nails salvaged from the ruins of a bridge in Nebraska. Folks at the trading post said he didn't speak much, just nodded, paid in coin when he had it, and left before the questions got too long. The boy was always with him, always bundled in blankets, always quiet. That winter was cruel. By the time spring came, most figured they'd either died or moved on. But Cal stayed, and when the thaw came, he began hauling stone, not cutting trees like the others, not plotting out a frame house or hitching his team for fresh lumber, just hauling stone, piling it, measuring it, digging trenches like a man possessed. They didn't understand. He never told them. Not once did he ask for help, not even when the wind snapped his tools, or when the floods rolled down from the hills and turned his trench into a cold mud coffin. He'd just dig it back out, bit by bit, day after day. His hands bled so often that the pick handles turned dark and slick with rust-colored stains. When they split, he wrapped them in cloth. When they cracked, he stitched them shut with horsehair. Some nights he'd carry the boy out in a bundle and lay him on the flat rock where the hearth would one day be. The boy would watch the sky while Cal worked in the dark, muttering to himself, setting the foundation deeper, wider, steadier. "You're gonna feel it, stay warm," he whispered one night, not knowing another man had come up the hill behind him. Elias Trow. He hadn't meant to spy. He'd just been tracking a coyote that killed one of his goats. But he saw Cal down in the pit, whispering like that to a boy who hadn't spoken in months, and it made his skin crawl in a way he didn't like. There was something about the way the man was laying the stone, not frantic, not careless, like a ritual, like a man writing a letter he knew he'd never get to send, but needed someone to find anyway. Elias went back down without saying a word. By midsummer, most of the town figured Cal was a lost cause. A quiet pity settled over the valley. No one mocked him anymore. They just stayed away. Let the madman with the sick boy dig his hole. But not everyone stayed away. There was a widow, Martha, whose own son had died the year before. She brought food one evening, just a loaf of bread and a boiled potato wrapped in a cloth. She left it on a stump without speaking. Cal didn't even look up. But when she came back 2 days later, the cloth had been folded and placed neatly on the stump, a smooth rock set on top of it to keep it from blowing away. She kept coming. She never asked why the foundation had to be that deep, or why he'd laid the stone in hexagonal interlocks that wrapped like a spider's web beneath the soil. She never asked why he set copper rods into the corners, or why he poured sand between the stones like mortar. She just watched and listened, and sometimes sat beside Nathaniel while he stared up at the sky, too thin to speak, his eyes clouded with whatever sickness still claimed him. One day she asked very softly, "Why this place?" And Cal finally answered, "Because the mountain never moves." That was all he said, but she understood. The boy couldn't walk anymore, couldn't sit up straight, couldn't speak, and the winters here would kill him unless he had something no storm could touch. Cal wasn't building a cabin, he was building permanence. He was building a way to outlive death. By fall, the cabin stood, if you could call it that, a small, simple room atop a base of stone, unlike anything west of the Rockies. The floor was slightly sunk, the walls thicker than a fortress, the hearth dug into a vented trenchwork lined with lime and sealed with clay. It drew heat from beneath somehow, warm even when the fire went out, a trick Cal never explained. The roof was nothing special, just timber and thatch, but the foundation was what mattered. And when the first frost came, Nathaniel didn't cough. When the second frost came, he smiled. That's when the stories started. No one had seen the boy smile in nearly a year, not since the fever. But there he was, curled in a blanket beside the hearth, smiling. Martha wept when she saw it. Some said it was the warmth of the floor. Others said it was something deeper, that the boy felt what his father had built for him, that the stone whispered safety, that the warmth came from more than fire, that it came from devotion. By January, half the valley had seen the inside of that little room. Cal didn't speak much, but he didn't bar the door either. He just sat beside his son, feeding the fire, adding stones to the walls now and then, reinforcing the base. Every night he tapped the stones with a hammer, listening to the echo. If one rang hollow, he'd replace it. If one cracked, he'd reset it. "You're gonna live longer than me," he whispered to the foundation. Nathaniel had begun humming, a low, soft sound, like a lullaby, only he remembered. Martha said it was a hymn. Elias Trow, who had once mocked Cal the hardest, said nothing now, just stood by the door, hat in hand, staring at the way the frost never seemed to touch the stones. Then came the fever again. Not for Nathaniel, for Cal. It hit in late February. He kept working through it, still tapped the stones, still checked the seals, still fed the fire. But his hands began shaking. His words grew slower. One night, when the wind screamed outside and snow tried clawing its way through the chimney flue, Cal passed out beside the hearth. Martha found him in the morning. She stayed 3 nights tending him. When he could no longer sit up, she whispered, "You've built enough. Let it be." Cal's eyes opened once more, just for a moment. "Not for me." Then he looked at Nathaniel, and the boy looked back, and something passed between them, something that made Martha step outside and cry for a long time. Because it wasn't grief. It wasn't despair, it was understanding, and she knew then what he'd truly built. A father doesn't build to survive. He builds to be remembered, even if no one ever says his name again. By the time the thaw came, the cabin stood silent, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full, like something holy had been sealed inside, and the land itself knew not to disturb it. Martha didn't tell anyone what had happened that last night, only that Cal had passed in his sleep. She said it with the calm of someone who knew it wasn't tragedy anymore, but completion. She didn't mention the way his hand had stayed resting on the hearthstone, or how the boy had opened his eyes just before dawn and whispered a single word, "Pa." It was the only word he'd spoken since the sickness. No one believed her at first. She didn't try to convince them, just helped bury Cal out past the tree line, near the ridge he'd once pointed to, and said would break the worst winds. They built a simple cross from 2 old pick handles, drove it deep. She asked Elias Trow to say something, but the man just shook his head and stood there with his hat crushed in his hands, silent. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been built in stone. Martha stayed on. She moved into the cabin with Nathaniel and left her own homestead to the squirrels and rot. Folks said it was a bad idea, that it'd bring grief to stay in the place where a man died like that, but she told them the truth plain. It ain't a place where he died, it's a place where he lived. And then the strangest thing began to happen. Nathaniel healed, not in leaps or miracles, but in slow, stubborn steps. First it was his voice, then the movement in his arms. By midsummer he could sit upright and hold a spoon. Martha taught him words again, simple things: fire, stone, wind, pa. He said that one the most. He pointed to the hearth and smiled when he said it. She didn't tell him how deep that hearth went, or how far down the base of the walls were sunk, or how the warmth stayed steady even after days with no fire. She just watched him grow stronger and stronger, until one day, late in July, she found him dragging a stone across the dirt toward the edge of the cabin. "What are you doing, Nat?" He looked up, panting. "It's loose," he said. She knelt down. Sure enough, one of the border stones Cal had set around the cabin's base had shifted after the rains. Nathaniel didn't want it to slip. He wanted it firm again. She helped him pack it back into place, her hands moving in rhythm with his, both of them working without saying a word. When it was done, he sat back and stared at the stone like he was listening to it, and she swore, for just a moment, he looked like his father. That fall, the valley saw one of the worst storms in a decade. Wind tore down 2 barns, flooded the west field, and blew the roof clean off the blacksmith's tool shed. But the cabin didn't shake, didn't rattle, didn't lose a single tile from the thatch. The fire stayed lit, the hearth stayed warm, and Nathaniel, curled in a wool blanket, told Martha not to worry. "Pa made it deep," he said. The next spring, travelers passed through, government men looking for rock formations and water sources. One of them, an engineer from Pennsylvania, was invited to supper at Martha's, now known to everyone simply as the Widow's Stone House. He looked around the place with eyes trained on angles and drafts and structural tension. "You folks built this?" he asked. Martha just smiled and pointed to the floor. "He did." The man crouched, ran his fingers along the seam where the wall met the base. He knocked once, then again, then paused. "You got something strange down here," he muttered. "Some kind of substructure?" Martha didn't answer. He came back the next next day with a notebook and asked to examine the cabin in detail. She allowed it, cautiously. He dug down beside the exterior wall, expecting a shallow trench like most frontier homes. Instead, he found layers of stone, hex-locked and pinioned, fitted so tightly no roots had grown between them. He kept digging, found copper rods set at angles, found trenches filled with crushed granite and sand. "This isn't just a foundation," he said. "This is engineered. Is that bad? It's unheard of. Out here, nobody builds like this." He wasn't the last. Word spread. Other travelers came. Some were skeptical, others curious. A few tried to buy the place outright. One offered Martha 30 gold eagles on the spot. She turned him away without blinking. "It ain't for sale. This place has a name, and it's not mine." "Whose then?" "Nathaniel's. And his father's, and if I ever have to explain that again, you won't be welcome back." They stopped asking. Years passed. Nathaniel grew. He built out the cabin slowly, carefully, never touching the foundation without first walking the perimeter and listening, always listening. He'd place his palm to the stones before lifting a shovel, whisper something under his breath. Martha didn't ask what. She just brought him tea in the afternoons and watched him work. By the time he was 16, the house had doubled in size, still just one floor, still humble, but the rooms had depth, the kind of depth that made people walk quieter when they stepped inside. They could feel it, the difference between this place and everywhere else, the way it seemed rooted. Nathaniel never left the valley. He turned away conscription officers, refused 2 jobs in the city. He said the same thing every time. "There's work here," and he meant it, because by then, the storms had returned. The first came in 78, a hailstorm that cracked windows across the county and flattened the East Ridge. The widow's house stood untouched. Then the quake of 81, small by city standards, but enough to split the chimney in Trow's barn and shatter every dish in the smith's cupboard. But not a stone shifted in Nathaniel's cabin. He invited folks in afterward, gave out bread and salt pork, poured cider into tin cups. The neighbors stayed long into the night, quiet, grateful. Some sat on the stone floor and ran their fingers along the seams, trying to understand. "It's like it wants to hold together," Elias finally said. Nathaniel just nodded. "It does." And when Martha passed, years later, he buried her next to his father. Same ridge, same windbreak. He built the marker himself. A cross, yes, but carved into a wheel of stone he fit into the earth so tightly it would take a crowbar to lift. "She said it was never her house," he whispered. But she was wrong. It was hers too. He built a bench beside the graves, sat there every morning for a year, and then he built again. Not much, just a small outpost, a dry shelter at the edge of the valley for passing travelers. He used the same methods: stone, sand, copper pins, deep set. Folks called it the root house. They didn't know how right they were, because by then Nathaniel had begun drawing, mapping, writing down what his father had done, what he had done, on wide sheets of butcher paper and wax-sealed cloth. He taught others, quietly, a carpenter, a mason, a boy from the next town who showed promise. He never called it school, never claimed any invention, just showed them how to listen to the stone. "Put your ear to the earth," he told them. "It'll tell you what it needs." When he died, he was 68, no wife, no children, but there were 37 buildings in the valley that stood on foundations he helped design, 4 that he built with his own hands. Each one still stands today. The original cabin, still there, a museum now, technically, but no signs, no tickets, just a quiet place people pass through, remove their hats inside, and sit for a moment on the old hearthstone. Some say you can feel a pulse in the floor, not like a heartbeat, slower, older, like something's still alive down there. One man brought a scan device in the 1950s, said the readings made no sense, too dense, too uniform, like a structure within a structure. He offered to dig. The town said no, loudly, because by then, they knew some things are meant to last, not because of the materials, not because of the engineering, but because of the reason they were built. That's why, when a surveyor's report in 2023 marked the cabin's foundation as still structurally pristine, someone at the archive scratched a note in the margin, possibly over-engineered for region, possibly sacred. They didn't know who Cal was, didn't know what happened that winter, what he did with his hands, what he said to the stone when no one was listening. But they lived in buildings that stood because of him. And Nathaniel, he whispered his father's name every night until the day he died. Because in a world that forgets men like Cal, a foundation that lasts 900 years doesn't speak with words. It speaks with warmth and silence and stone. The cabin was never supposed to become legend. That wasn't Cal's goal when he drove the first stone into frozen soil with a cracked hammer and bleeding swaying palms. But legend doesn't ask permission. It grows from the cracks between what people saw and what they felt, from what outlasts men's memories, from what endures long after a name is forgotten. By the third generation, Cal's name had already started to vanish from retellings. Now it was Nathaniel's cabin, or sometimes the widow's stone house. Other times, especially when the storms came through and flattened barns and stripped shingles from brand new roofs, it was just called the one that never moved. No matter the name, everyone knew what it meant. A place that had never failed. A place that outlived floods, snow, hail, wind, and more than one war. And though Nathaniel had died with no children of his own, what he left behind rippled through the valley in ways even he hadn't expected. One of the boys he taught, a red-headed carpenter named Milo from 3 Ridges East, went on to build the region's first schoolhouse foundation using Cal's methods. Milo didn't call it Cal's method. He called it root locking, though everyone knew where it came from. When that schoolhouse survived the ice storm of '92, when every other building for 40 miles suffered cracked beams and collapsed porches, the community stopped calling it luck. They started calling it a pattern, and by the turn of the century, that pattern had a following. Stonemasons, engineers, even military outpost planners began to take interest. Quietly at first. No one published anything. It wasn't science yet. Just stories passed between men who noticed that certain old cabins, some with no chimneys, others with dirt floors, some reduced to frames held together by rotting nails, still had one thing in common: foundations that wouldn't fail. And when they traced those back, they kept landing in one valley, a tiny scratch of green and rock barely noted on most regional maps. A place the old folks still called Cal's Hollow. Of course, not everyone believed. Some called it superstition. Others accused the townsfolk of burying concrete under the soil and claiming old magic. One traveling scholar even wrote a short paper in 1907 attempting to debunk it. He lasted 3 nights in the cabin. The story goes that on the 4th day, he left at dawn, didn't say a word to anyone, and mailed his research back with one note scrawled on top: "It breathes." That became the title of the paper when someone finally published it decades later. It breathes anomalous thermal and structural properties in the foundation of the widow's cabin. He tried to explain it with geothermal venting, capillary action, subsoil resonance. He built models, ran simulations. None of them matched the data. The floor stayed warm in all seasons. The seismic scans bounced oddly, as if the foundation had angles the machine couldn't measure. And strangest of all, no lichen or moss had ever grown between the stones, even though the rest of the valley's rocks were thick with it. The town still didn't let him dig. The second man who tried, an industrialist from back east, offered to buy the cabin outright in 1933, promised to preserve it, even offered to move it, stone by stone, to a national park museum. He was met at the county line by 6 farmers, 3 women, 2 retired masons, and a boy holding a wooden sign that read, "It's not for sale, it's home." The industrialist turned back. After that, the valley closed ranks. They started a tradition. Every child born in the region was brought to the cabin on their first winter's day, wrapped tight, carried in arms, and sat, just for a moment, on the hearthstone. Some babies fussed, some giggled, but almost all grew quiet when placed on the stone, as if listening. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was a blessing. But by then, no one in the town needed proof. The stories were proof enough, and not just stories of survival, stories of return, because over the years, men who left the valley came back, always in winter, always alone, men who'd grown up in houses built by Milo or by Nathaniel himself, men who'd fought in wars, buried parents, lost children, lost themselves. They came back to sit on the hearthstone. No words, just silence, and sometimes tears. One man, a veteran with half a leg and a haunted look, sat there for 2 full nights, didn't eat, didn't speak, just sat. When he finally stood, he left behind a medal and a photograph of a boy. He never came back. The photo stayed, pinned to the wall. It's still there now, but the cabin's not alone anymore. In the 1970s, an earthquake hit the outer hills, minor by global standards, but devastating locally. 4 homes collapsed. A bridge cracked in half. Emergency crews worked for days. Engineers came from the city to assess damage and offer support, and they saw the cabin, standing, untouched. A man named Julian Ryder, head of the Regional Engineering Bureau, walked the perimeter, flashlight in hand. He tapped stones, measured shifts, took soil samples. Then he asked the oldest man in town, an ex-miner named Buck Hauser, how the foundation was laid. Buck just pointed to the earth. "You don't lay it, you listen to it." Julian smiled politely. Then he went home and spent 10 years studying the method. When he returned, it wasn't as an engineer, it was as an apprentice, to the foundation. He moved into the valley, built his own cabin, not a replica, no one dared copy it exactly, but a respectful echo, hex stones, deep trench work, copper and sand. He called it the listening method. And when he taught his son, and that son taught his, the valley's silent knowledge turned into something else. A tradition, passed through hands, not books, through sweat, not lectures, through stone, not ink. They never formalized it, never turned it into a school or a company. But by the 2000s, builders from as far away as Scandinavia and Japan had visited the site, sat on the hearthstone, and gone home changed. A few tried to replicate it. One succeeded. A stonemason from Iceland named Thomas built a small house on a windswept plain using the same method. Hexagonal sub-foundation, sand and granite trench fill, deep-set copper pins, no glue, no cement, just shape and gravity. That house is still standing. It's been through 5 blizzards, 2 floods, and 1 volcanic tremor. The floor hasn't cracked once. When Thomas was asked how he knew what shape to use, he said, "I dreamed of a man laying stones." He never looked up, but he was humming Nathaniel's hymn, the one he'd hum as a child, lying beside the hearth, the one his father had never taught him, because it had never been sung, only felt, only built. Now, over 170 years after Cal first laid that stone into frozen soil, the cabin remains. People don't live in it anymore, not full-time. It's kept as it always was, simple, clean, quiet. A few additions have been made: a hand pump outside for water, a solar lantern for winter nights, a logbook for visitors. That logbook is filled now. Dozens of volumes, thousands of names, and nearly all of them say the same thing. It felt like someone had been waiting for me. Some write pages, others just leave a single word, home, and still the foundation endures, uncracked, unshifted, untouched by time, wind, snow, flood, or fire. Not because of some magic, not because of some secret material or technology, but because of what it was made for: a father, a son, a moment of impossible love made solid, made real, and buried deeper than death. Sometimes engineers try to measure it. Sometimes scholars come with scanners and sensors and theories. They leave with questions, always more questions. One, a geophysicist named Emily Soroyan, took seismic readings and found strange harmonics under the cabin, subsonic tones, barely perceptible. She said the Earth itself seemed to change pitch around the structure. She never published. She just left a note in the logbook. "I think it's singing." The town doesn't call it a miracle. They don't need to. They just nod when people ask. "He built it for his boy," they say, and when asked who, they smile. Doesn't matter. The stone remembers. Some winters hit harder than others, and some stories only surface when the wind cuts deep enough to remind people why certain things are still standing. The worst storm in living memory came in the year 2081. It had been an unusually dry fall, the trees dropping their leaves in silence while the soil turned brittle beneath them. Everyone said the same thing. It didn't feel right. The stillness was wrong, the air too sharp. Animals migrated early. Wolves howled at dusk when they hadn't howled in decades. Then came the cold, not slowly, not politely, but all at once, like a wall of ice that dropped from the sky and swallowed the ridges whole. Snow fell for 16 days straight. Roads disappeared. Generators failed. Roofs cracked, and beams snapped like dry twigs under the weight. Some folks didn't make it. The valley lost 4 homes the first week. A 5th burned when a chimney collapsed and sparked the tinderwood inside. And when the phones went dead and the power lines dropped, they remembered the cabin, not the engineers, not the state, the people. One by one, they trudged through snow chest high, children wrapped in quilts, faces red and raw from windbite. They didn't need maps. They didn't need coordinates. They followed the stone. It took hours for some, days for others. One woman carried her elderly mother on a sled over 2 ridges, down through the frozen riverbed, and up the rise toward the cabin. Another man brought 6 children, only 2 of them his. They said nothing on the journey, just kept walking. When they arrived, the door was already open. The light inside was low, just a solar lantern flickering beside the hearth. But the warmth hit them like a memory. The floor, as always, was warm, and not just the surface, the air. The walls, the space itself. No fire had burned there in weeks. The wind outside howled with a voice sharp enough to flay skin. But inside, silence reigned. Not cold silence, living silence. The kind of stillness that only comes from deep roots. Someone whispered. It remembered. No one knew exactly how many arrived that first night. The guest log froze shut. One of the panes cracked from moisture when the temperature dropped past 60 degrees. But what mattered wasn't the count. It was the coherence. The way people who hadn't spoken in years sat beside each other, backs against the old stones, hands clasped around tin cups filled with hot snowmelt and bark tea. Someone lit a single candle. Someone else brought out a book of hymns and hummed. It wasn't worship, it was memory. The cabin held them. 38 people survived inside that structure through a cold snap that flattened entire districts. They kept the solar lantern alive with pocket panels and rationed the melted snow. No one complained, no one fought. The children played games with pebbles on the floor. They said the stones made the pieces hum. On the 12th night, someone brought out an old radio and powered it with a crank battery, static for hours. Then one word came through. Cal, just that, once, clear as glass. They turned the dial, silence. They tried again, nothing. Some blamed the signal. Others said it was a fluke, a misheard syllable from another channel. But the boy who heard it first, the one curled up by the hearth with frost still clinging to his lashes, shook his head and whispered, no, it was him. That boy, Eli, would later become the Valley's quietest historian. He wouldn't write books, wouldn't give interviews, wouldn't go on record, but he would build, and what he built would carry forward something no archive could ever hold. He was only 9 that winter, and yet 30 years later, when the foundation of the regional hospital collapsed under water saturation and seismic stress, Eli was called in, not as an engineer but as something else. No one had trained him in soil mechanics. He hadn't studied geodesy or structural engineering, but he walked the perimeter, crouched by the cracked stones, and pressed his hand into the ground. Then he said, "You dug too shallow." They laughed. They stopped laughing when he mapped the new layout by hand. He didn't ask for money, just asked that the basement be hexed and the corners copper-pinned. That hospital still stands. And the floor in the maternity ward? Always warm, always. People stopped asking how after a while. The question changed. Now they asked why. Why did a man build something that deep, that lasting? Why the copper? Why the granite sand? Why the nested hexagonal trenching, the deeper root shapes, the perfect interlocks? Why in a time when survival barely meant getting through the week, did one man build for centuries? And the answer was always the same, whispered between sips of cider and shared beneath lantern light. Because his son had stopped walking. And for a father, nothing else matters. When you love like that, you don't build for comfort. You build against the grave. You build not to defy death, but to outlast forgetting. And in the face of time's erasure, stone speaks clearer than names. That's why, 200 years after Cal died, a delegation from the Structural Preservation Committee of the Intercontinental Heritage Trust visited the site. They didn't come with scanners. They didn't come with surveys. They came with questions, but not about the method, about the man. And they were told what had always been told, that the man's name was Cal, that his son was Nathaniel, that the cabin had been raised in silence, with blood in the mortar and frost on the hands, built not for pride or science or acclaim, but because a boy needed to not freeze, and the father couldn't let him. So he dug and laid and whispered and left behind a warmth that made strangers feel known. The delegation wept, not from sadness, from recognition. One of them, a woman from the Andes, said, "We thought we were alone, that our ancestors were the only ones who built for forever." And the town elder said, "No one builds for forever. They build for the ones they love. Forever just comes after." That winter, the trust asked permission to place a single marker, not a monument, not a plaque, just one stone, unmarked, placed beside the hearth. The town agreed. They brought it in quietly, without ceremony. Eli was the one who set it in place. He didn't measure, didn't level, he just listened, pressed his ear to the floor and waited. Then he nodded, and the stone was placed. To this day, no one speaks while inside the cabin, not because of rules, but because the silence asks it. You feel the stillness wanting to hold, not suffocating, not empty, just whole. Like a breath that never left. Even modern builders, with their drones and concrete, come away different. One wrote anonymously, "I've built skyscrapers, dams, foundations that support thousands of tons, but I've never felt a building hold me back, as if it were asking me to stay." That builder never built again. He became a teacher of stonework, taught his students to listen before lifting. He called it the Cal Principle. No textbooks, just stories, just silence. Just a sketch of a cabin with roots beneath it, reaching deeper than the page. And every student, upon graduation, was handed a single copper pin and a stone no larger than their palm. The copper to remind them of permanence, the stone to remind them of love. Back in the valley, snow still falls. Children still walk up the ridge on their birthdays to press their hands to the hearth. Mothers still hum. Fathers still tell the story without needing words. And beneath it all, the foundation sleeps, not dead, not inert, just present and waiting for the next hand, the next stone, the next boy who needs a floor that stays warm through the freeze. In the year 2306, a Landslide struck the southern ridge above the valley. It came after weeks of strange rains. Too warm for the season, too fast for the soil to hold. Locals had warned the district engineers, said the rock layers were tired, the trees too thin, the roots losing grip. But maps don't feel what stone feels. Reports don't listen to wind the way old men do. So when the ridge finally gave, the valley's warning had already turned to prayer. The flood tore through the upper reaches in the middle of the night. Whole trees moved like twigs in the slurry, their trunks grinding together like bones. A footbridge snapped like a matchstick. A century-old barn twisted and folded in half, its stone base shattered under the churn. Fields were scoured bare. The sound was low and awful, like the sky cracking open from beneath the earth. But when the water hit the cabin, it split. Not around it, not over it, split, as if the very ground deflected the current, as if something rooted there refused to move and the flood obeyed. Surveyors later swore the current shifted by 8 full degrees when it struck the rise where the cabin sat. They ran models, simulations, nothing explained it. The foundation was too small to break a current that size, and yet not a single stone had shifted. The soil around it eroded, but the trench held. The hearth stayed dry. When the waters retreated, the valley gathered around what remained. They didn't speak. No one had died. Every building that had followed the old designs, stone-locked, deep-pinned, sand-layered, was still standing, but only one structure had stopped the flood. That's when the questions began again, deeper ones, not about engineering, about faith, because by now, it had been nearly 300 years since Cal's hand last touched stone, and yet the work still held, the warmth still radiated, the floor still gave off that faint, dry heat that no thermometer could trace and no hearth could explain. The word miracle had been used sparingly for generations, but this time even the skeptics were quiet. The trust returned, older now, institutional, bureaucratic, but they came with respect, not cameras, not scans. They requested something unprecedented, to listen, no equipment, just time. They wanted to sit, and they did, one at a time. Over days, each person was allowed an hour alone in the cabin. No notes, no sound, just the hearthstone, the stillness, the weight of the air. The director emerged in tears. She didn't speak at first. Later in her report she wrote, "We expected to find evidence of ancient building ingenuity. What we found was devotion made permanent. We've been measuring things all wrong. The strength of this place is not in the materials, it's in the intention." That report was never published. She resigned 2 months later, moved to the valley, took up stonework, never explained why. Some truths don't need translation. The town, meanwhile, kept its rhythm. Children were still brought to the hearth on their birthdays. Couples still touched the threshold before marriage. When someone died, their name was read aloud on the porch, one foot resting on the outer ring of stone that Cal had set without knowing it would one day become sacred ground. Then came a boy named Tom. He was quiet, like Cal, born during a lightning storm, never spoke until he was 6. His father died when he was 2, but his mother said he was always building. First it was pebbles, then clay, then little arches of dried twigs tied with horsehair. He never talked much, but when he worked with his hands, it was like watching someone pray without knowing they were praying. At 10, Tom asked to spend a night alone in the cabin. The elders hesitated. The rules had changed. The world had changed. But his mother trusted him. He brought no food, no tools, just a stone he'd carved himself, and a copper pin given to him on his birthday. He laid them by the hearth. Then he laid down beside them. He didn't sleep. He listened. In the morning, the hearth was warmer than usual. No one knows what he heard. He never said. But from that night on, Tom worked, quietly, relentlessly, not copying the cabin, but answering it, as if the foundation had asked a question, and he'd understood the shape of the reply. He built a wall first, not around anything, just a wall, 6 feet long, 3 feet high, sunk 2 feet into the soil, hexed base, layered trench, stone interlocks, copper pinned. He sat in front of it each morning and whispered something to the earth. People began to leave things there, not offerings, not superstitions, just memories. A shoe, a child's drawing, a photograph in a tin frame. Tom never touched them, just kept building. Another wall, then a corner, then a path. No one called it a building, not yet. But when the earthquakes returned, the land that held Tom's walls never cracked. And when he finally built the roof, it was shaped in a way no one had seen before, angled toward the wind like a hill trying to lean into the storm. It never creaked. By the time Tom was 30, he'd built something not quite a home, not quite a hall, not quite a monument, just space, pure space, held by intention, shaped by silence, bound by stone. And when the valley gathered inside it for the first time, they didn't ask what it was. They knew. It was what Cal had started. It was what Nathaniel had continued. It was what Martha had preserved. It was what Eli had taught, and what Tom had finally named. Not aloud, but in stone. Above the hearth, He etched 2 words, stay warm, no name, no date, no dedication, just the truth. Now, centuries later, archaeologists debate the origin of that phrase. They write about climate theory, socio-cultural metaphors, linguistic shifts. They measure the stone, they carbon date the copper, they track magnetic resonance across the trench grid beneath the structure. But they can't explain why the hearth still gives off heat, or why, when you lay your hand on the stones, you feel your own heartbeat slow, and your eyes begin to sting, and some memory you never lived swims up behind your ribs like light through deep water. They don't explain it because they can't, and maybe they never should, because Cal didn't build it to be understood. He built it because his son couldn't walk, because the cold was coming, because a man who has nothing left will build with everything he is, and if he builds deep enough, if he builds true enough, the warmth will last, even when the fire's gone, even when the world forgets his name. The warmth will stay, and the stone will speak for him.